In 1793, the United States of America was 17 years old and had no capital city. The founders had argued about it for a decade. New York wanted it. Philadelphia wanted it. Virginia wanted it somewhere on the Potomac, far enough south to keep the northern states from controlling the new government. They compromised the way the founders always compromised, in a back room over dinner. Alexander Hamilton got his federal assumption of state debts. Thomas Jefferson got the Capitol on the Potomac. The deal was made at a dinner table in New York City in the summer of 1790. What they got for that deal was a 10-mile square of swamp and forest on the Virginia-Maryland border. No roads, no quarries, no population, no workers. A French engineer named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant drew the plan, a grid of streets broken by diagonal avenues radiating from two grand focal points, a president's house and a Capitol building on a low hill above the river. L'Enfant was fired before he built a single thing. He refused to share his plans with the commissioners. He tore down a house belonging to a well-connected landowner because it sat in the path of one of his avenues and did it without asking anyone. Washington let him go. The commissioners inherited L'Enfant's vision and a problem. They had to build a seat of government for a nation scheduled to move there by 1800. 7 years. A Capitol building, a president's house, federal offices, bridges, roads, all of it on ground that was mostly mosquito bog and second-growth timber, and they had almost no money. Congress had given them almost nothing to work with. The plan was to sell lots in the new city to raise construction funds. Nobody wanted to buy lots in a swamp. George Washington rode down from Mount Vernon personally to pitch land sales to speculators. Most of them passed. So the commissioners did what every American construction project of that era did, when the work was brutal and the pay wasn't enough to attract men who had other options. They rented enslaved people. I've been reading the Commissioner of Public Buildings records. The surviving ledgers are held in the National Archives, written in the tight copperplate hand of an 18th century clerk, columns of names and figures, wages paid out, materials received, work completed, and running through all of it, woven into every page, are entries for enslaved laborers, listed by first name only, with the name of their owner beside them, because the commissioners were not paying the men. They were paying the men's owners. If you care about the people who actually built the building where American democracy was supposed to live, the men who cut the stone and carried the brick and mixed the mortar, whose names are not on any plaque inside that building, please subscribe to Forgotten Labor right now. This channel lives or dies on subscribers. Hit the button and come back. Because what I found in those ledger pages is something the official tours don't mention, and it has been sitting in those archives for over 200 years. Here is what you have to understand before any of this makes sense. By 1793, slavery was not a thing that existed at the edges of the American economy. It was the economy. The tobacco fields of Virginia, the rice plantations of South Carolina, the indigo operations of Georgia, all of it ran on enslaved labor. And the new capital had been planted directly in the middle of that world. The 10-mile square straddled Virginia and Maryland, two slave states. The men who owned the land the city was being built on were slaveholders. The commissioners overseeing the project were Virginia men who understood exactly how the labor economy of that region worked. When they needed workers, they knew where to look. They advertised in local newspapers. I have the text of one of those advertisements, reproduced in a 19th century account of the city's founding. It called for Negro carpenters, bricklayers, sawyers, and common laborers to be hired out by their owners to the public buildings commissioners at a monthly rate. The rate for a skilled enslaved carpenter was about $5 a month, paid to the owner. Common laborers fetched less. The man doing the work saw none of it. The enslaved workers came from plantations in Alexandria, Georgetown, and the surrounding countryside. Some were brought in from farther away, hired out in batches, 5 men here, a dozen there, seasonal contracts renewed if the owner was willing, and the work continued. At peak, in the building, seasons between 1795 and 1800, estimates drawn from the commissioner's records put the enslaved workforce on the capital site alone at roughly 400 to 600 men per season. That number shifts depending on how historians read the incomplete records. What the records make clear is that enslaved labor was not incidental to this project. It was structural. They did the hardest work. 1. They cleared the land. Jenkins Hill, the low rise where William Thornton's winning Capitol design would sit, was covered in old timber and scrub. The trees had to come down, the stumps pulled, the ground levelled. 80 men, with axes and saws and ox-drawn chains, cleared it over the course of 1793 and into 1794. Then the grading, then the foundation trenches, cut 4 feet deep through the clay and decomposed sandstone of the hill, straight-walled trenches measured and checked against surveyors' stakes. You cannot build a stone foundation on uneven footing. The men who dug those trenches dug them by hand with iron spades in the July heat of a Potomac summer. Then the brickwork. The Capitol consumed millions of bricks over its 7-year construction. Those bricks were made on site in kilns erected on the east side of the building ground. The process was simple and brutal. You dug the clay. You puddled it with water until it reached the right consistency, not too wet, not too stiff. You pressed it into wooden molds, 1 brick at a time. You struck the top smooth with a wet rag. You turned the green brick out to dry in the sun for 2 or 3 days. Then you stacked it in the kiln, hundreds of bricks at a time, and fired it for 48 to 72 hours, feeding the fire with wood. The temperature had to stay high enough to vitrify the clay, not so high it cracked the bricks. A good burner could judge the temperature by the color of the flame coming out of the kiln vents. The enslaved men working those kilns worked in 12-hour shifts. The summer of 1797 in Washington was one of the hottest on record. The kiln site was documented by a contractor's assistant who wrote a brief account of the construction for a Philadelphia newspaper. He noted that the brick burners worked through the night by firelight and that several men had to be relieved mid-shift from the heat. He did not record their names. He recorded the output: 12,000 bricks in 4 days from one kiln. And then there was the stone. The Capitol was built of sandstone quarried at Aquia Creek, about 40 miles south down the Potomac in Virginia. Aquia Creek sandstone is a pale buff color, soft enough to cut with hand tools, and it had been used for Virginia manor houses for generations. The commissioners contracted with quarry operators to supply dressed stone to specification. The quarry operators in turn used enslaved workers to do the cutting. The method for cutting dressed building stone in 1795 was the same method it had been for 1,000 years. You identified the grain of the stone, the direction the rock would split cleanest. You drilled a line of holes with a hand drill, steel bit driven by a wooden mallet, each hole 2 or 3 inches deep, spaced 6 inches apart along the split line. You drove iron feathers and wedges into the holes and tightened them in sequence until the stone cracked along the line. Then you dressed the faces, chisel and mallet, stroke by stroke, until the surface was flat and square to specification. A dressed face on building stone had to be true to within 1/8 of an inch. A block that was out of square would show in the wall. The mortar joints would be uneven. The courses would drift. An experienced stone cutter could feel a bad face with his fingertips before he measured it. The overseer's log from the Aquia Creek quarry in the summer of 1797, a fragment that survived in a Maryland county deed book because it was entered as evidence in a later property dispute, records the work in the flat language of a man accounting for production. Stone cut this week, 47 feet face measure. Stone lost to cracking, 6 feet. Men present, 14. Men absent, sick, 2. 14 men cutting 47 feet of dressed sandstone in a week. In July, heat at a Virginia quarry, working iron chisels and wooden mallets. The 2 men absent sick do not have names in the fragment. They are recorded as number 1 and number 2, which was the quarry's numbering system for its enslaved workers. I do not know what was wrong with them. Quarry work produced stone dust that coated your lungs and left you coughing by the end of a month. The creek nearby was both the drinking water source and the waste dump for the operation. Waterborne illness moved through those camps in the summer. Cuts from flying stone chips went septic in the heat. The contractor's doctor, if there was one, is not mentioned in the fragment. Number 1 and number 2. Absent 2 days. Back in the count of 14 the following week. The stone they cut that summer and the summers before and after, it is in the walls of the United States Capitol right now. Before I tell you about the 2 men I was able to find by name in the commissioner's ledgers and what the records tell us about where they went after the construction ended, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries these videos unless enough people tell it they want to see them. 1 click, come back. Because what happened to the men I found in those ledgers is the part that I keep returning to. I want to tell you about Len. He appears in the commissioner's payroll records, listed as the property of James Hoban. Hoban was the Irish-born architect who designed the president's house and supervised construction on both buildings. He had come to America as an indentured carpenter, made his name in Charleston, and arrived in Washington with capital, connections, and several enslaved workers he had brought north from South Carolina. Len was among them. He is listed in the records as a carpenter. He appears across multiple building seasons, 1795, 1796, 1797, and into 1798. His entries are associated with Finnish carpentry on the Capitol interior, floor framing, window and door casing work. The detailed work that comes after the rough structure is up. Finnish carpentry is skilled work. It requires reading a drawing, transferring measurements accurately, cutting joints that fit without gaps, understanding how wood moves with moisture and temperature. A man who couldn't do those things wouldn't be assigned to it. Hoban received $5 a month on Len's behalf. The entries are in the same handwriting, the same ink, the same matter-of-fact accounting style as the entries for sand, lime, and iron nails. I looked for Len past those payroll records. He does not appear in any manumission deed for the district. He does not appear in any census record under Hoban's household that I could find. He does not appear in Hoban's will, which was probated in 1831. What that most likely means is that Hoban sold him at some point after the capital work ended. The sale records for enslaved people in Alexandria and Georgetown during that period are incomplete. He could be anywhere in them. He built the floors and window casings of the United States Capitol. He is not named anywhere inside it. The second man I want you to know about is named in the records as Daniel. He is listed as belonging to a Georgetown landowner and merchant named Notley Young. Young was one of the principal original proprietors of the capital city. He owned a large portion of the land the government purchased for the new district and was paid accordingly. He was also paid by the commissioner for the use of Daniel across at least 3 working seasons. What is interesting about Daniel is that his labor classification changes in the records. In 1796, he is listed as a common laborer. In 1797 and 1798, his entries are associated with masonry work. He learned something on that site. Masonry, laying brick and stone in level courses, mixing mortar to the right consistency, reading a plumb line, building corners that stay square, is a skilled trade. You do not arrive at it by accident. Someone showed Daniel what they were doing, or Daniel watched carefully enough to teach himself, and by his third season, he was doing it well enough to be classified differently in the payroll. When the capital construction wound down, Daniel went back to Notley Young's property. Young died in 1802. His estate inventory, which I found in a transcript of Maryland probate records, the pages dry and brown at the edges, lists enslaved people by first name and estimated value. There is a Daniel on that list, valued at $300. $300 was a high valuation for 1802. It reflected a skilled man. Whether it is the same Daniel from the capital payroll, I cannot say with certainty. The name was common, but the valuation fits, and the geography fits, and the timeline fits. $300. A man who had helped build the capital of the United States, assessed at $300 in a dead merchant's estate, and sold to settle debts. Subscribe. I keep asking because the part that comes next, the burning, and who rebuilt it, and what the Congress that met in that building did and did not do to account for the labor that built it, is the part I want you to stay for. The British burned the Capitol on the night of August 24th, 1814. A force of British soldiers under Admiral George Cockburn entered Washington after the American militia broke and ran at the Battle of Bladensburg. Cockburn walked into the Senate chamber and held a mock vote on whether to burn the building. The vote passed. His men piled up furniture, books, and anything that would catch, poured gunpowder on it, and put it to the torch. The sandstone walls cracked in the heat. The wooden roof structure went entirely. The Library of Congress, roughly 3,000 volumes, burned. The chambers, the committee rooms, the corridors, everything combustible was gone. A thunderstorm that night helped save the outer shell. The rain came down hard enough to put out the fire before the stone superstructure collapsed. When the commissioners surveyed the damage the next morning, the walls were standing, scorched, cracked in places, black with soot, but standing. The same Aquia Creek sandstone that the unnamed quarrymen had cut from the Virginia hillside in 1797 had held. They rebuilt. The reconstruction began almost immediately. Irish craftsmen were brought down from Philadelphia. Local stonecutters were brought back to repair the damaged walls. And enslaved laborers were rented again, because the legal structure had not changed and would not change for another 50 years. The records for the reconstruction are less complete. Several of the commissioners' files had themselves been burned or water damaged in the attack. But what survives shows the same pattern. Hired out enslaved carpenters and bricklayers, listed by first name, wages paid to owners. By 1819, the building was functional again. A new low dome had been built over the central rotunda. The chambers were restored. Congress resumed its business. Here is what I keep coming back to when I read those records from beginning to end. The men who built this building did skilled, precise, demanding work. The bricklayers laid courses that survived a fire set by a professional army. The stonecutters dressed blocks to within 1/8 of an inch, and the walls those blocks went into are still standing. The carpenters framed floors and fitted casings that served for decades before being replaced, not because they failed, but because the building was expanded. This was not low-skill labor performed under duress and nothing more. These were craftsmen who knew their trades and practiced them well under conditions that would have killed many of the men who later sat in the chambers above their foundations. They were compensated nothing for any of it. The country that assembled in that building went on to become the wealthiest nation in human history. The commerce it enabled, the law it shaped, the institutions it built, all administered from a structure whose foundations were laid by men who were themselves legal property. That is not rhetoric. That is what the ledger pages show. In 2000, as part of the Capitol Visitor Center project, the architect of the Capitol's office commissioned a formal research project into the enslaved labor used in the building's construction. Historians worked through the same commissioner's records. A scholar named Jesse Holland published a book on the subject in 2007. The findings were not disputed. The evidence was there in the archives all along. A plaque was installed in the Capitol Visitor Center. It is in a corridor. It is small. Most visitors do not stop in front of it. The building has had more work done to it than almost any other structure in America. The dome you see today was built in cast iron in the 1850s and 1860s. The east and west fronts were extended in the 1950s and 60s. The building you walk through is significantly larger than what John Adams moved into in 1800. But the lower courses of the original walls are still there. Inside the foundation corridors, you can see the old Aquia Creek sandstone, the pale buff-colored stone that came up the Potomac on barges from the quarry below Fredericksburg. It has been painted over more than once, patched where the 1814 fire cracked it, but it is there. The men who cut it are not commemorated anywhere in the building that rests on their work. There is no plaque for Len the Finnish carpenter who worked $5 a month into James Hoban's pocket for 4 building seasons. No marker for Daniel the laborer who taught himself enough masonry to move up in the payroll classification and was valued at $300 when his owner's estate was settled. No monument for number 1 and number 2 at the Aquia Creek quarry, absent sick in the log for 2 days in July 1797, back in the count of 14 the week after. No names on any wall for any of the 400 to 600 enslaved men who worked on this building in its first 7 years. In the architect of the Capitol's conservation collection, there is a mason's hammer recovered during renovation work on the Capitol's original foundation corridor. Iron head, rotted wooden handle, found wedged behind one of the original sandstone blocks during a 1990s repair project. The conservator who found it estimated its age at 150 to 230 years based on the ironwork style. It was put behind that stone by a man whose name is not recorded. The stone is still holding. If you've stayed this far, please subscribe. Tell the algorithm there are people who want to hear about the men and women the official version of the story leaves out. I'll keep looking for them as long as you tell it you're here. I'm glad you stayed with me. The United States Capitol. Begun 1793. Constructed with the labor of between 400 and 600 enslaved African American workers, alongside Irish craftsmen, free black laborers, and local hired hands. Completed 1800. Burned 1814. Rebuilt. Expanded. Still in use. The men who built it are not on the tour.